Welcome to InFocus with Ejaz Haider. This program is supported by the Center for Security Strategy and Policy Research. CESPA is an autonomous policy research center housed in the University of Lahore, and it tackles issues that impact contemporary security and strategic development. And this program is part of that effort. Now, increasingly, the affairs of this world remind me of Ted Hughes's Apple Tragedy, a poem that upends the book of Genesis and tells the reader in the punchline and everything goes to hell. In a near replay of his announcement of a ceasefire between Pakistan and India, US President Donald Trump announced a ceasefire between Iran and Israel after a series of bizarre postings on his Truth Social platform. Well, on a lighter note, when I say bizarre with reference to Mr. Trump, I don't mean it in the words English language meaning as something very strange and unusual, but quite the opposite, something usual to Mr. Trump, even as it might be unusual for the humankind in general. But let me not digress. He praised his precise strikes on 3 Iranian nuclear facilities, then announced a ceasefire, then went on to talk about peace and love between Iran and Israel. Meanwhile, Israel's genocidal Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu wanted to deliver a final blow, so he sent in his fighters. That got Trump's goat in a big way, and he dropped the F-bomb in describing the situation. Then he went on to call Netanyahu, and it seems that for now, he's got a ceasefire. In any case, everyone and Charlie's aunt know that Israel cannot sustain its wars without the US's financial and military help. And so when the US president speaks, Israel has to listen. But the real question is, what does this ceasefire mean? There's already too much evidence of how the US and Israel got Rafael Grossi of IAEA to set Iran up. He's fast going the way of the disgraced Richard Butler of Iraq weapons and inspection infamy. Clear also is the fact that IAEA is not what it used to be under Mohammad al-Baradi. The entire war was choreographed to pressure Iran to agree to the sticking point of zero enrichment. Netanyahu, of course, also wanted to degrade Iran's capabilities and decapitate the military leadership and kill scientists. So there was something for both Israel and the US. So what next? This is the question I want to take up with my panel of experts in this episode. I have with me Dr. Reza Khanzadeh, a senior foreign policy advisor to the US-Iran Chamber of Commerce. Dr. Khanzadeh is a Middle East expert and Iran analyst. His forthcoming book, Iran's Establishment in the Other, the Islamic Republic, Ideological Capital, and Unrealized Aspirations, is set for release later this year. With him is my old friend, Dr. Kamran Bokhari. Dr. Bokhari is a senior director at the New Lines Institute. He served as director of the Analytical Development Department at the Institute from 2019 to 23. He's also a national security and foreign policy specialist at the University of Ottawa's Professional Development Institute, and at one time served as the Central Asia Studies course coordinator at US State Department's Foreign Service Institute. So thank you to both of you. Let me begin with Reza, if I may. So Trump has got a ceasefire, and as I said in my opening, it's almost like a kind of replay of what he did with the Pakistan-India thing. Of course, the fact is that while there is a ceasefire of sorts between India and Pakistan, there is no framework for talks between the two. And it seems to me that in the case of Iran, Trump would probably want Iran to come back to the table and think that Iran now will be more amenable to those points that it wasn't so amenable to in the previous 5 rounds. Do you think my reading is right?
Yeah, I do believe. Well, first, thanks for having me. I do appreciate this opportunity to be amongst this esteemed panel. I do believe that your assessment is right, but I feel that Trump's approach or strategy is misguided in a sense. One thing we have to consider is that with the level of extent that Iran's nuclear program has progressed over the past, let's say, 15 to 20 years, the vast majority of the Iranian people inside Iran do support some type of nuclear program. Now, whether that's civilian or otherwise, that's for the future to hold. But with this approach that Trump has had, while in the short term seems to be a advantageous type of approach, because one thing about the DC bubble is that it is very polarized. You're either on the left or you're on the right. You're either a dove or you're a hawk. Very seldom do we see a politician, let alone a US sitting president, kind of walk the middle where he's borrowing from both the Democratic and the Republican playbook, where he shows peace through strength, but then he's still pushing for peace more than anything. Because we've seen in the past couple of days how Trump wants to have a diplomatic off-ramp, even with the strikes against Iran and its 3 nuclear sites. It was, to a certain extent, telegraphed to the Iranian regime, which gave them time to vacate those 3 premises of people and also of much of their nuclear stockpiles and what have you. So this approach for him to try to weaken Iran enough to bring them back to the negotiating table, to then use this level of strength to tell Iran, look, if you don't agree to these terms, we'll just keep striking you and bombing your sites, I think is going to backfire. Because to understand the approach from Iran, you have to understand the full history of Iran. And of course, we don't have time in this program to go into that depth, but to put it shortly, Iran, not just the government, but the entire country, has no trust really of the government in the United States. It doesn't matter who the president is, they just don't trust Washington. It goes all the way back to the 1953 coup of the Prime Minister Mossadegh, all the way until now. So when it comes to getting to the table to actually negotiate a nuclear deal, I think Iran, and more specifically this regime, is still going to pursue a nuclear program that is just a few steps away from a nuclear weapon, because they feel that is one of 2 things. First, it is a safety guarantee for them that they will not be in harm's way as far as more Israel, strikes from Israel. But also, it's their only bargaining chip, because when you see Netanyahu pushing Trump to want to attack Iran, for Netanyahu, it's not just about the nuclear program. It's really about this regime, and it's more so about Israel retaining or maintaining their military hegemonic strength within the Middle East. Because prior to this, 12-day war, the 2 strongest militaries in the Middle East was Israel and Iran, and now it's clearly just Israel. So Iran really doesn't have any bargaining chips if they do go back to the table to negotiate the nuclear program. So they need this nuclear program in order to get sanctions relief, in order to be welcomed back into the world community, so to speak. So I don't think Trump's approach really is going to work in the extent that he believes it will.
Right. Well, in any case, Article 4 of the NPT does not specifically mention enrichment, but it mentions those activities that necessarily, in terms of fuel cycle, would involve enrichment. And the entire point previous to the JCPOA was to have some kind of consortium outside. I remember Russia saying that they would give Iran the enriched uranium. 20% of enriched uranium, low enriched uranium, Iran actually gets from one of the Russian companies still. But Iran's point of view is that by the very wordings of Article 4, even if it does not explicitly mentions enrichment, it means that Iran has the right to enrich uranium. KB, I want to get your opening thoughts with reference to the question that I posed to Reza in terms of what next, the immediate steps. I mean, we do know that there was collaboration between the US and Israel about this particular episode. But we also know that the Israeli political strategic objectives are very different from that of the United States, or at least have been. So how do you see the situation unfolding immediately? And then what possible trajectory could it take?
Thanks, Ejaz, and it's good to be on your show. Look, I think that it's been, the statements aside, the Truth Social posts and the media, interviews and comments aside. So
Okay.
you know me, I tend not to read into them too much because they're designed for public relations, and all sorts of imperatives are driving the statements. I try to understand what's happening behind the scenes. So in my effort to do that, what I've been able to discern based on events is that the president isn't interested in any war, conflict, regime change in Iran. He's been very consistent about that. Uh, the fact that Steve Witkoff, the president's special envoy, has all along been talking with Abbas Araghchi, who is the Iranian foreign minister, not just during the military campaign launched by Israel, but even after the United States struck Fordo and Natanz and Isfahan. And so the, that tells me clearly that this isn't. And then the way in which yesterday's performative retaliatory strike at Al Udeid Air Base near Doha also establishes that. And then the American president's statements about ceasefire and whatnot. So I just want to put that on the table, that I don't think that that's the American imperative. The American imperative over here is just one thing: that there shouldn't be a pathway for the Iranians to acquire nuclear weapons. That's not an American position. That is a European position. That is a Russian position, a Chinese, a Pakistani position. That is the position of Turkey and Saudi Arabia. And so the difference is that the United States is the only one capable of doing this, and non-proliferation is some one of those objectives of the United States government, regardless of who's in the White House and regardless of which party is in the White House. And so the what I'm trying to say here is that I think it's a limited scope, and beyond that, I think that if you look at the broader picture of the world is unanchored from the 70, 80-year history, post World War II history. The world is very different, and it's the old ways of doing things are not functioning. So this president has come along understanding that what the American public wants, and has based his entire politics on that, which is why he won the election and whatnot. Now the question is, how do you reduce American exposure on the international arena? So one of his ways of, or lines of effort, is to withdraw from the heavy lifting being done in European security, and by extension, of course, the Ukraine war, because that's the active battle space right now. The same logic applies to the Middle East, and the same logic applies to the Western Pacific with China, although with some differences. There's some unique situation in the Western Pacific basin that require a different approach. On the Middle East, there are four powers in the Middle East that the United States, any American government, any American administration has to deal with. It's in no particular order: Israel, Turkey, Iran, and Saudi Arabia. And if regional stakeholders are going to take the lead in managing security in their region, with the United States stepping back, and this, mind you, isn't a Trump thing. This is what the whole Obama thing was about: pivot to Asia, no boots on the ground, the aftermath of the disastrous wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. So this is a long time in the making. So how do you do that if you're Trump? Well, you upgrade Saudi Arabia, because Saudi Arabia is a financial powerhouse, but it does not have sort of the military power projection capability, the strategic power projection capability that other states of that size do. You have Turkey, and Turkey is dealing with Syria. You have Israel in a situation where it's dealing with Gaza, Hezbollah, the whole axis of resistance of Iran, and everything that has happened post October 7, 2023. And then you have Iran. And these other three players can see that you can bring them into some form of a loose architecture. This player isn't ready yet, Iran, to be brought into that. And I think that the first, in order to do that, was to, okay, can we, get Iran to not have nuclear weapons, and in exchange offer, sanctions relief to bring Iran back into the fold of, the region, and of course the broader international community. Can we normalize this situation? It's very difficult, but I'm just telling you the strategy over here. And I think that if you look at that strategy, then you can understand what's happening. Is he being successful? Well, clearly not, because of everything that's been happening. He wanted to reach a deal, went through 5 rounds of negotiations, couldn't. He saw that, hey, the Iranians think that, hey, because I'm anti-war, I'm against forever wars, I'm bluffing when I say that, Israel is going to do this, or we're going to do this, and it's going to get ugly. All that colorful language that comes from the president about, dire consequences. So they didn't come to the table on 0% enrichment. And then what is the choice left? Your base says don't go to war. Your base is actually divided, and you don't go to war. So,
but you need to. But you need to pressure.
Israel,
I get you. I get your point. I get you. I won't go to Reza on this. I get your point that from your perspective, there seems to be a grand strategy here. I frankly, I'm not particularly sold on that. Having my own experience of inside the Beltway, in terms of how I saw the United States get into Iraq, how I saw the Israelis actually push the United States into Iraq, how I saw the United States and the Beltway pundits not entirely understanding that they were actually seeking an accident, not entirely understanding what Iraq was. So, broad brush, grand strategy, it might be, but I don't think that there's some kind of imbrication of various bricks that actually form the roof. But Reza, the thing is, the entire US strategy, from where I stand, appears to be that Israel is the US military outpost. Trump has tried through the Abraham Accords last time to basically try and bring into the Israeli ambit, or the Israeli US/US ambit, as many Arab countries as it possibly could, the crown and the jewel being Saudi Arabia. Iran was the outlier, throwing a wrench in the works with its axis of resistance. And it seems to me that basically what the strategy here is to get Iran, as KB has also said, to get Iran to accept a rollback. Essentially, zero enrichment is a rollback of its nuclear capability, knowledge, whatever, infrastructure, and the rest of it. To have Israel basically emerge as the military overlord of the region, and then get Saudi Arabia to normalize with Israel, and presumably everything will be hunky-dory after that. Of course, I'm leaving out multiple details here, just a broad brush.
Sure.
Do you think that given the trajectory, the Iranian trajectory, both in terms of the revolution, in terms of the ideology, also in terms of the resistance inside Iran to that ideology, which has manifested itself in various ways, whether it was through Rafsanjani, whether it was through Khatami, whether it was through other reformist leaders. Do you think that's likely to happen? Do you think Iran is ready to actually be pulled into this grand US/Israeli strategy?
No, unfortunately, I don't think so. With this current regime, the way it's structured, the way it's built, and plus with Khamenei being 86 years old, and his time on this earth being very limited, I think this regime's primary focus right now is its own self-preservation, its own existence, being able to put in the framework necessary to have a successful transition beyond, Khamenei. And that right now for the Islamic Republic is the most important, you know, policy approach, if you will, for them. It's more important than these last 12 days with these strikes against Israel. It's more important than, getting into a deal with the United States and its nuclear program. It's more important than, normalizing relations with its Arab neighbors, because this regime has based its entire existence on a zero-sum strategy counter against Israel and the United States, and building a relationship with the Palestinian people and the Palestinian cause for a two-state solution. So if there's any divergence from that, then the past 40 years of this regime's existence is put under question. But the thing is, this regime's already being put under question.
I just want to pace it a little, because we kind of halfway through the episode. See, let me just take your argument. I won't take this to KB also. When you say regime survival is the primary thing, and I totally agree with you. That's what it has always been. Now, assuming that there's a lot of US pressure, assuming that there's a threat of resumption of hostilities, that in and of itself would then perhaps force the regime to try and balance, the two imperatives. First being regime survival, second being nuclear enrichment, and nuclear enrichment as a metaphor for the entire nuclear program.
Sure.
In that, what do you think if there is an existential threat to the regime, what would the choice be?
The choice would be the regime's existence.
Reza, can you hear me?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah. There's an existential threat to the regime.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Yeah, the choice would be the regime's existence, because we have to keep in mind that when this regime first started, the clerics and the mullahs were the face of the regime. They took all the political offices. They ran and held all the positions within the government. And then the IRGC was obviously busy fighting a war for 8 years. And then when those 8 years passed, there was no seat at the table, so to speak. There was no piece of the pie for the IRGC to take, and they felt slighted. They felt, we put all our blood, sweat, and tears, and we died for this regime, and now you don't have a place for us within this regime. So they found a way through the economy, through the black market, through the sanctions, through all the ports of entries, to build a billion, if not $trillion empire, to then counter the weight of that, of the regime, of the mullahs. So this regime survival is of the utmost importance.
Absolutely. So therefore, it stands to reason, on the basis of what you're saying.
But that balancing act for the regime really falls on a multitude of seesaws, so to speak. It's not just this binary approach where
it's not going to be easy. It's not going to be easy. But let me just pull in KB on this. And then we'll try and get some more nuances before I wrap this up. KB, what do you think? I mean, it's now been established, and I know I've been reading your writings. That regime survival is the most important thing. So if it actually gets down to deciding between existential threat to the regime and making some kind of compromise on the nuclear program, Reza is clear that regime survival will be the first thing, and I'm assuming that that's what you also think.
Yeah, I think that, look, this is just so regime preservation has been an obsession since the founding of the republic. It is the most important thing, which they never got over. Why? Because the regime has never consolidated itself. It's sort of walked through over the decades from crisis to crisis. The crisis of overthrowing a monarchy and establishing a new regime, a regime that's imposing a particular ideology on a very diverse society, ethnically, politically, culturally, and socially. The Iraq War, the sanctions, the conflict with the United States, then the building of the axis of resistance. They have known that they have been vulnerable, and they have never really consolidated. And then the bouts of unrest since the 90s, at least, late 90s, the student protest in 99 onwards, has shown that this regime is sort of, it always sees itself as a heartbeat away from potential crisis, collapse, whatever. And so this has been the foremost thing. They've never gone beyond that thinking. So they've been doing this forever. But what is different now? What is different now is you're at a very historic moment that Reza alluded to, which is the 86-year-old supreme leader who basically built this republic. He's been at the helm for 36 years. And you will recall, I wrote a report last year in April of 2024, basically talking about an evolutionary regime change process that's been underway for the better part of the last 20 years, and trying to sort of extrapolate from that and look at what a post-Khamenei Iran would look like. And so that thing is on top of, add that as a major weight on the pre-existing condition of regime preservation, and regime preservation. Those are the priority lists. And so if you've never gotten over that, and now the founder of that, or the guy who built the republic, is about to move on, and then we know the clergy has lost power. The power has shifted into the hands of the IRGC, but then once you don't have the supreme leader, what is the next supreme leader going to come in and just pick up the baton and say, okay, you know what, let's move forward? No, he's going to be a much weaker supreme leader, because he's going to be dependent on the military, all the more so than Khamenei himself. And so the idea, and then you have two militaries, and one military just got hit. Notice that I have not seen any evidence that the Israeli airstrikes have targeted specifically anybody from Artesh, the regular armed forces. It's primarily the IRGC and their personnel and their facilities.
Right.
So if a vacuum is being now created, that has to be filled. Notice now you have the chief of staff, which basically is the joint chief of both militaries, is from the Artesh. It used to be, his predecessor was from the IRGC. You have the defense minister who's from Artesh. You then have the Artesh commander who has a seat on the Supreme National Security Council. So you have a 3-to-1 ratio right now in decision making. And when there's a vacuum, you're going to have people coming in and saying, who's responsible for all of this? I mean, it's pretty damning that, the Israelis are flying jets and hitting targets essentially with impunity, because you never built an air defense system, or if you did, it wasn't worth anything. And, I'm sure there are many people within the Iranian elite, regardless of where they stand on ideology and their fealty to this regime, they have to be speaking about, well, this decades-old policy has brought us ruin. And look where we are at a very precarious moment in our history. And so how do we get to that other side? So yes, they will, under these circumstances, and that's what the US is calculating, that under these circumstances, the likelihood of the Iranians agreeing to 0% enrichment for now, nothing lasts forever, is there. And so we can move forward. We can get out of this current logjam that we're in. I'll leave it at that.
It'll make sense from the American and the European perspective. And which is why I said that, this probably, instead of being the hedgehog, they're probably going to act like a fox and show some flexibility. But Reza, the whole idea of regime change as propounded by Netanyahu, and we know Netanyahu has been at it for the last 30 years. He has been doing every second, third year, he's been, coming up with something or the other about, the Iranians are just 6 months away from a nuclear program.
Yeah.
It's such a terrible thing to see Grossi basically coming up with a report on activities prior to 2003 using the Israeli intelligence report of 2018 to ask for a resolution from the Board of Governors on June 12th, which is the 60th day of the deadline,
Mhm.
even as the Israeli planes are being loaded for a
Mhm.
strike on the night of June 13th, 2 days before the sixth round. I mean, it seems that there's not even a pretext of being part of this entire choreographed circus.
Yeah.
But tell me, KB has raised a very important point. I will add to that in terms of the questions being asked. You've been spending a lot of money. You have created a forward defense. You actually controlled uh, proxies over wide geographies and with, not just Shia proxies, but also Sunnis.
Mhm.
And you were really good at asymmetric war.
Mhm.
But you knew that you were going up against Israel and the United States. Why was there absolutely no effort to build an air force at least strong enough to make some showing, not allow complete air supremacy to the Israelis, and to wed it to some kind of ground air defense? You think those questions are being asked? You think that the Iranians made a huge miscalculation by not investing in the Air Force? There's an interesting line from a personal interview by Wali Nasr of Jawad Zarif in Wali's recent book, where Zarif says that, oh, we never had the money to build a strong Air Force. Give me a sense of, because you've been looking into this for so long, give me a sense of why this miscalculation.
Yeah, I think the miscalculation goes back to what we were talking about earlier about that balancing act of being able to preserve the regime, continue a nuclear program, and support their axis of resistance. The the regime has essentially stretched itself thin over the past, um, I would say, maybe 10 years, especially with the vast increase of domestic uprisings added to that calculus. It's not now. It's not just regional and international issues they have to put money towards, but it's also domestic issues as well. And they really are stretched thin, up to the point now where you walk the streets of Tehran and Esfahan and Shiraz and Mashhad. There are more women not wearing the hijab than there are women wearing the hijab, and there's very little policing happening because the regime knows this is one battle right now we just can't engage in. We have other things to worry about. And that type of balancing act for the regime is putting out fires 1 minute after the next or 1 hour after the next, to where one of those issues that fell at the wayside that was overlooked was their land to air missile technology and their air force. And we even see their navy. I think it was maybe a year 2 years ago they built this navy ship and it sank, right? So even when they try to build a navy or build an air force, they're really taking scraps from what they have left over or what Russia is willing to give them. But again, with the Russia-Ukraine war, we see Iran building very cheap and quick to make drones that they send to Russia, and they've used it themselves against these attacks against Israel. But to really build an air force that can withstand these types of attacks from Israel, it's just beyond the scope of what the regime is able to do, or I would say willing to do at this point. And that's why they're building these, um, I forget the name, but the most recent, nuclear site is even deeper under the ground, deeper under a mountain. And most of these sites that are underground, that is their way of kind of filling that gap of not having a strong air force, to where they just build these sites, under the ground. So yeah, I think you're right. It is a great miscalculation, but I also think it's one step at a time for the regime, where they just can't overstretch themselves too thin.
My own sense is that Iran was never expecting or never wanted to get into a direct confrontation with Israel. Uh, Events outside Iran's control actually forced Iran's hand. I mean,
That's right.
Hamas's October 7th attack, and how Hezbollah had to come to the aid of Hamas, but in a calibrated way. The Israelis patiently penetrating Hezbollah, waiting for the opportunity to strike, killing the Ismail Haniya in Tehran, you know, giving the Iranian leadership, including Rabah Ali Qadr, the terrible choice of not responding while a guest is being murdered, or responding and then playing into the Israeli hand. Then the assassination of Hassan Nasrallah, along with his entire top leadership. Iran again goes for direct confrontation. That was the time Israeli retaliation actually probed and tested Iranian capabilities.
Yeah.
And I won't go as far as to say that, they found this to be more of a Potemkin village, but they did realize that Iran will not be able to, basically stop them if they send in fighter jets.
Right.
Although I do say that, the Iranian missiles have done a lot of damage there, which the Israeli censors have not allowed to come out. But nonetheless, the balance has, clearly been in favor of Israel.
Yeah.
So, KB, final thoughts on, I'm not going to ask, well, actually I will, because you do a lot of future projections. Normally I don't do that because, I myself feel very queasy when someone asks me to, say, oh, what's going to happen now? But I know that you do future projections. So I'm going to ask you this without feeling guilty about it. How do you see things panning out in the next 3 to 6 months?
So that's a great question, and it has three separate parts to it. One is the messiness of the current moment, the battle space moment. We have a ceasefire, and nobody knows whether it's going to hold or not, and how long, and will there be more rounds of back and forth? We just don't know. So that has to be factored in. It could be that it holds. That's one possibility, but one has to leave room for the possibility that it could break down. I mean, ceasefires break down all the time. And so then that sort of keeps us in this current moment for a while. In the meantime, the negotiations are always, humming along in the back channels behind the scenes. And so that question will continuously be posed, because what are the Iranians asking? I mean, the foreign minister has openly, stated this, that look, get Israel to stop attacks, and then we're ready to show flexibility. What does that flexibility mean? Are they ready for 0% enrichment? I think after the destruction, after the U.S. involvement, and the dropping of 14 of those GBU-57s, I think they're in a position where they have no choice. But they can't throw in the towel. They can't come out looking like they're capitulating. So this has to be engineered, just as yesterday's retaliatory strike was engineered. So I think there has to be an engineering of an off-ramp and say, okay, now, because then what does the U.S. want? The U.S. wants a deal, and the ask of Iran is basically sanctions relief. That's the most important thing right now that is on the priority list. That is what will get them regime preservation. With more financial bandwidth, so those conversations will happen. In the meantime, a third layer is happening. So the current messiness, this negotiation, and the third layer is what's happening internally right now with the balance of power, with Khamenei, moving out slowly, as Reza, pointed out. We don't know how many more, years, months, days he's going to live, but it's safe to say that we're in that transition. The fact that he told the New York Times, or had his people tell the New York Times, that, look, we're looking at a succession process where we've given a list of 3 peoples and so on and so forth. So there's that process going on.
Which doesn't include his son, by the way.
Say it again?
Yeah, that list doesn't include his son, right?
It doesn't include. I never thought his son was a contender. Personally, I never thought, because at the end of the day, I don't think it matters who becomes supreme leader. The shots will be called by the military, and yes, the Khobragan, the Assembly of Experts, is going to go ahead and vote in somebody, but that candidate will already be there will be a consensus, and that takes time. So these are three processes that I'm going to be looking at moving forward from the current moment all the way to a year out.
Mm.
Okay, I think that's a very good assessment. Reza, do you agree with what KB is saying? I mean,
I
those are the
do.
three phases, and
Yeah, very, yeah, very well
so
put.
I want to be a little want you to be a little specific with reference to how that off ramp will be engineered. Now, it is important. Sanctions relief is important. We also know that when Biden came and he wanted to get back to some kind of iteration of the JCPOA, the Iranians were adamant on two things. One was that there should be sanctions relief as precondition for talks, and something should be built into the talks that actually says that an incoming administration
Mm.
will not scuttle the framework once again. And I think they were
That's right.
perfectly justified in doing that, but Biden could not do that.
You're right.
So, what are you expecting this time?
I think the approach that we've seen with the first 5 rounds of talks where Iran's Arab neighbors were included is the most important, I guess element of these negotiations. Being able to bring in these competing countries that are neighboring Iran could then allow Iran to compromise on a few items that they might not have already compromised on up to that point, because then they feel like they've built this consolidated front to where it could be used as a way of leveraging the other aspect of this entire Middle East crisis, which is Israel and them trying to build on the Abrahamic Accords. So if Iran can find a way to bring in more of its Arab neighbors, to then tell them, look, I am working with you guys in order for there to be peace, in order for our nuclear program to not be, targets of more, war or attacks. You guys need to work with us now to try to build a two-state solution. Because if that can happen, then we're really into this new shift where all the focus now is on Israel. Because Israel is to blame for more than half of what's going on in the Middle East. But the attention has constantly been on Iran and its axis of resistance. Rightly or wrongly, that would be a whole nother conversation to have. But if the shift and the focus could be placed back on Israel to say, look at what Iran, look at what we have done. We have compromised on our nuclear program. We have worked with our Arab neighbors. We are now looking towards some type of Abrahamic Accord where it includes Saudi Arabia. But now Israel is not listening to anyone. They don't want So that's I think that would be the calculus. That would be the strategy of Iran to kind of put the spotlight on Israel. Because even in the United States, even when we look at the MAGA movement and we look at the types of politicians, like the younger generation politicians that are coming into the Republican Party, most of them do not support the type of relationship the United States has with Israel. That's something we have never seen in the United States. And it's not something about anti-Semitism. It's more about just the Israeli government has this hell-bent obsession with trying to inflict as much chaos and as much conflict as they can in order for them to just remain the military superpower. And that goes back to conversations about some type of regime change in Iran. For Netanyahu, regime change is not important to him. It's more about regime collapse, being able to have that regime collapse, chaos ensues, some type of civil war maybe, to where Iran is just in disarray, and then that way they're no threat to Israel, and then the airspaces are still free, and then so those types of calculations are also a part of the way Iran approaches these negotiations when it comes to their nuclear program. For them, when we see the way Iran approaches, the U.S. in the Middle East, at some times it can be seen as a zero-sum strategy. But when it comes to these, negotiations with their nuclear program, that for them is not a zero-sum strategy. They do take into consideration other elements that are a crisis throughout the Middle East, and, most of which that I've already listed when it comes to, like the Abrahamic Accords, and also Israel not having the spotlight on them for all the atrocities they've committed.
Absolutely. I mean, obviously it makes sense. Obviously, Iran might try to do this. But the way I look at the lay of the land, while Israel is increasingly, and for all the, reasons, fast becoming a pariah state, it is still within the ambit of the global power configuration, which is led by the United States and with its Western allies. Nary a word by anyone on the complete illegality of the Israeli attack on Iran. Iran is right to actually lodge a formal complaint against Grossi. Grossi has not condemned the strikes at all, even though it's shown concern with reference to strikes on nuclear facilities. So anyway, it's going to be an interesting situation to which obviously we'll observe. That's an occupational hazard, but it does remind me of a verse by our poet Allama Muhammad Iqbal, which says, तकदीर के काजी का ये फतवा है अजल से, है जुर्म ज़ईफ़ी की सज़ा मर्ग मफाजात. So, the fact that if you're weak, history is the logic of might. And I think that is where I would close this program. Thank you so much, Dr. Kamran Bokhari, Dr. Reza Khanzadeh. Lovely to get your insights. That's all from this episode. If you like this, subscribe to the channel. It doesn't get me any lucre or the think tank any lucre, but it'll help you to, there'll obviously be a notification to you, and and if you make your comments, it helps us to improve what we are doing. Until our next episode, stay safe and goodbye.